Hello there. Welcome to my weekly meditation. I am Reverend Devon, and if you are looking to nurture a progressive faith and are open to a second opinion, please know that no matter who you are or where you are in your life journey, you are welcome in this place. And so please also feel free to like and subscribe and share these messages with anybody you feel called to.
Today's reading comes from Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as he and the disciples made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched Jesus to see whether or not he would cure him on the Sabbath. The Pharisees watched, so that they might accuse Jesus. And Jesus said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But the Pharisees were silent. Jesus looked around at them with anger. He was grieved by their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The man did so, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out immediately to conspire with the Herodians against Jesus on how to destroy him. Hello, sisters and brothers. Welcome to our weekly video meditation here at the Ascension Lutheran Church. And today we are examining this passage from the end of Mark chapter 2, going into Mark chapter 3, the story of Jesus basically criticizing and defying the laws in first century Israel about the Sabbath. And this is an interesting passage to look at. It shows Jesus in an act of civil disobedience, and it also shows Jesus pointing out the ways in which our understanding of law, tradition, and even our own values can misinterpret the intentions of God and how God speaks to us, and the ways in which we as people of faith should try to be aware as to whether or not those beliefs, those traditions, those laws, those values are being used in a way to hurt people. The message of this passage is, I feel, pretty clear and straightforward, but it does bring up questions about how we live into faith, which are less easy to understand and live into. But essentially, here we have Jesus saying that if we are following God's commands, then we are going to be doing so in a way that does not harm our brothers and sisters and helps us coexist with one another. And so when we look at this passage, when we look at the way in which the Pharisees respond to Jesus and the way in which Jesus responds to them, I think it says a lot about the world that Jesus was living in, and also it draws a lot of parallels to the world that we're living in today. Within the biblical narrative, we often throw a lot of flack at the Pharisees because they continually do not get what Jesus is going on about. Very often they are rooted in legalism over the love of God, and it's unfortunate that most people nowadays are not able to recognize that the Pharisees in a lot of ways reflect us. We human beings trying our best to live into God's commandments as we understand it. The way in which this passage starts out with Jesus talking about King David and how David said the Sabbath exists to serve human beings and human beings do not exist to serve the Sabbath, I think fundamentally lays out how Jesus saw biblical laws within his time period. He believed that the laws that God gives us are meant to help us as human beings love one another and coexist with each other. And he had no problem breaking those perceived laws if people were not living into them in a way that was helpful. And so we see Jesus traveling during the Sabbath, which was a big no no. We see Jesus and his disciples eating during the Sabbath. Well, in Israel in his time, you're not supposed to be doing that either. You're supposed to be fasting. We see Jesus healing people during the Sabbath. You know, Jesus is working hard on the Sabbath to help people. And the reason I believe he is doing this is because he does not see God's commandment to rest on the Sabbath day as a commandment not to help people. Honestly, I think that that message is pretty straightforward. I probably don't need to explain why that makes sense to at least my congregational audience here at Ascension. What I think we need to be examining is, why is it that the Pharisees had their hearts hardened to this message? How was it that they were not able to see this obvious comparison in how it made sense? And really, at the end of the day, I think that the reason why it is often hard for us as people to cross examine, to look at our own way of doing things, and to identify ways in which they're harmful and wrong, is because it forces us into a situation where we have to recognize that we are the problem, that we are the ones who need to change. And that can be extremely difficult for anybody. I think that we see it happening in America today, where we are going through a bit of a cultural shift, and people are starting to call out our history, the way in which our government works, and the ways in which it is harmful for others. And we are noticing, the blatant capitalism and the way in which it oppresses lower classes. We are noticing the ways in which we have told history in the past that are harmful to people of color, or people who are LGBTQ plus, people who are transgender. We are noticing the ways in which the perception of faith, the perception of God that people have, is being used in a way that weaponizes God against women in their access to contraceptive care, or people who are trying to migrate into the country over the border. The way in which God's name is used to justify hatred and bigotry and violence within this country is obviously criticized in this passage. But that hardness of heart that we see from the Pharisees is very much a normal human reaction to when we get called out for doing something wrong. And so the real sin of the Pharisees here is not being willing to listen to a contradictory point of view. And the challenge for us as people of faith is to open up our hearts to those voices that contradict our understanding of God within the world. Because honestly, I do not believe the Pharisees in this story understood the way in which their adherence to the Sabbath law was harmful, even though Jesus pointed it out directly in front of their faces. I don't think that they were able to understand that not being able to heal people, not being able to eat, for some people, that was harmful, life threatening, and that sometimes people need to be lenient with the laws and the structures and the beliefs and the traditions that we have within our lives to bring out the greater good. I think that this passage, where Jesus criticizes the Sabbath, he's not criticizing God's commandment to rest. He is criticizing the way in which people understand that commandment to rest, the way in which they live into that commandment to rest. And he is saying that if you want to know, full stop, the wrong way to follow God, look to whether or not you are hurting another person. If you are doing harm through your beliefs, you are wrong. And you need to find another way of believing. this doesn't point us into the best ways of believing. And I think that that is the open-ended question here. Jesus is telling us what not to do when we're trying to live into a life of faith, but Jesus isn't exactly telling us what to do when we're living into a life of faith. And I think that if we're going to look at something like the Sabbath, I mean, Sundays nowadays are jam-packed with people working and doing stuff. We don't really adhere to the Sabbath anymore in our society. And honestly, we ministers, geez, we're the primary culprits. We work our butts off on Sundays. And whether or not we should be resting and fasting, I can't really tell you whether or not the way in which we are living into the Sabbath is correct or not. Jesus says that we should have some leniency when it comes to this commandment. We are all for leniency nowadays. But maybe it is important to set aside times in which you can rest. I don't rest on Sundays, but I do try to set aside times for myself where I get to tend to my own soul, tend to my own well-being. And maybe that is more in line with God's commandment to rest than the way in which people in the first century understood it and the way in which Jesus is criticizing it. I don't know. But what I do know is that when we live into these commandments in a way that is helpful, that is an indicator that we are doing it right. When we live into our commandments in a way that is harmful, that is an indicator that we are doing it wrong. And so, how do we integrate these commandments lovingly into our own lives, into our own communities, our churches? How do we make that more of the norm than the type of harm and rhetoric and anger and hatred that we are seeing coming from congregations nowadays? Again, I don't know the answer. And this is a short meditation, but I think that it's a good question. How do we follow the commandments of God as God intended, and not just in the way in which we want to understand them?